The evening air carried the sweetness of freshly cut grass and roses in bloom, drifting across the Carter family's backyard. Strings of golden lights hung from tree to tree, twinkling like captured stars. Evelyn Carter, 55, stood at the center of it all, adjusting the placement of a bouquet on the buffet table. She had planned this night for months, her son Daniel's college graduation party. Every detail bore her touch: the linen tablecloths she ironed herself, the framed photos of Daniel as a child, the subtle jazz humming from the speakers. For Evelyn, this was more than just a celebration of Daniel's achievements. It was proof that all the long nights of sacrifice, of balancing bills and encouraging homework, had been worth it. She looked across the yard and saw her son in his cap and gown, tall and beaming, surrounded by friends. Pride welled up in her chest until it almost hurt. Richard Carter, her husband of 30 years, clinked his glass against another man's in a booming laugh. At 58, he carried himself with the air of a man who had built a good life: strong jaw, salt and pepper hair, and a reputation in the community as a successful businessman. Tonight, he played the role of proud father perfectly. He hugged Daniel, slapped him on the back, told stories of his first Little League home run to the guests. Evelyn watched him, and for a fleeting moment, felt that warm, familiar pride too. But then she noticed it: the way Richard's eyes lingered across the yard, not on Daniel, but on someone else: Laura Bennett, Evelyn's younger sister. Laura arrived late, as she always did, stepping into the party like she owned the ground she walked on. At 52, she still carried that youthful allure, the kind that drew eyes without effort. Her dress shimmered under the lights, cut just low enough to spark whispers. Evelyn felt her stomach twist as the crowd murmured about Laura's beauty, how she hadn't aged a day. It wasn't new. Laura had always been the kind of woman who thrived on comparison, standing taller when others felt smaller. Richard's gaze caught on Laura the moment she appeared, and Evelyn saw the flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. It was small, quick, but to a wife who had studied every expression for decades, it was enough. Later, when he offered Laura a glass of champagne, his fingers brushed hers a second too long, too light to draw attention. But Evelyn's heart caught in her chest like a snare. She told herself not to overthink it. This was Daniel's night. She wouldn't let her imagination ruin it. Daniel bounded over then, wrapping his mother in a hug that smelled of cologne, an accomplishment. "Thanks for all this, Mom. You went overboard." Evelyn laughed softly, brushing his cheek. "It's what you deserve." Grace, her 21-year-old daughter, stood nearby, arms crossed. She wasn't as swept up in the glow. Her sharp eyes scanned the party, landing on Laura, then on Richard, then back to Evelyn. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "She looks like she's here to steal the spotlight." Again, Evelyn pressed her daughter's hand. "Let it go tonight, Grace. This is your brother's moment." But Grace wasn't the type to let things go. Evelyn saw her watching, her suspicion mirroring the unease Evelyn herself felt. The speeches began an hour later. Richard raised his glass, his deep voice booming, "To my son, Daniel. Proof that hard work, sacrifice, and family values create success." The guests cheered, glasses clinking. Evelyn smiled outwardly, but inside the words soured on her tongue. Family values. He said it with such conviction, as though the phrase itself were carved into his bones. And yet Evelyn had seen his lingering looks, his shared laughter with Laura, an intimacy in their body language that no one else seemed to notice. Helen, Evelyn's lifelong friend, slipped up beside her, wearing a knowing look. "You've outdone yourself again," she murmured, glancing at the decor. But then her eyes flicked toward Laura and Richard, still laughing together across the yard. Helen's brow furrowed. She didn't say anything more, but Evelyn caught the silent question in her expression. Evelyn forced a smile. "It's just a party," she whispered, though the words didn't steady her. As the night stretched on, laughter rose, champagne flowed, and Daniel basked in the glow of his friend's admiration. For everyone else, it was perfect, a celebration unmarred. For Evelyn, however, perfection had already cracked. She stood under the golden lights, watching her husband and her sister share a secret rhythm, too subtle for most eyes but glaring to hers. She pressed her hands together, willing herself to swallow the unease. Not tonight, she told herself. Don't ruin this for Daniel. But in her gut, a seed had been planted, dark and stubborn. A seed that whispered something was wrong, and tonight was only the beginning. Laura Bennett moved through the crowd like she had been rehearsing her entrance for weeks. Heads turned as she made her way across the backyard, every step in her shimmering dress catching the glow of the garden lights. She smiled that polished smile of hers, the one that could disarm strangers and irritate Evelyn in equal measure. Evelyn's throat tightened as she realized how deliberate it all seemed. The whispers started almost immediately. She looks incredible. Can you believe she's over 50? Evelyn heard snatches of admiration floating among the guests. Some didn't even bother lowering their voices. Evelyn smoothed the fabric of her navy blue dress, elegant but understated, chosen so Daniel's graduation photos wouldn't be about her. But with Laura present, she felt like she had been cast in the role of supporting character at her own son's celebration. Grace, hovering at her side, narrowed her eyes. She's dressed like it's a gala, not a family party. Evelyn gave her a look, silently asking her not to add fuel to the fire. But Grace wasn't finished. It's always like this with her. She has to be the center of attention. Evelyn inhaled slowly. She wanted to agree because Grace was right. But she also knew tonight wasn't about battling old rivalries. She wanted Daniel to remember joy, not tension. Leave it, sweetheart, she murmured. Richard, however, didn't leave it. His gaze swept across the yard and landed firmly on Laura, holding a moment too long. A smile flickered between them, familiar, private. Evelyn's pulse kicked up. She watched as Richard excused himself from a conversation and crossed the lawn toward Laura, two champagne flutes in hand. Laura's laugh rang out above the hum of chatter as Richard offered her a glass. Their fingers touched as they exchanged it, just as they had earlier. But this time Evelyn noticed how Laura didn't pull away quickly. Instead, her hand lingered, her head tilted as though listening intently. Richard leaned in, chuckling at something Evelyn couldn't hear. Helen sidled up beside her again, holding a plate of hors d'oeuvres. She certainly knows how to make an entrance, Helen said dryly. Evelyn's lips tightened. She always has. You okay? Helen asked gently, following Evelyn's line of sight. Her eyes rested on Richard and Laura, and she didn't need to ask more. Evelyn forced herself to nod. It's Daniel's night. It had become her refrain, like a prayer she repeated to hold herself together. Later, as Evelyn stood with Daniel posing for photos, Laura drifted over and slipped an arm around her nephew. Oh, Danny, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. You make the whole family proud. Didn't your father and I tell you this day would come? Evelyn's stomach dropped. Your father and I. It was such a small phrase, but it sliced into her. Daniel beamed, oblivious, but Evelyn caught the way Richard grinned back at Laura, as though the two of them shared a secret. Grace's eyes darted to Evelyn's, sharp with recognition. What trip are they talking about? She whispered. Evelyn frowned, realizing she didn't know either. Don't, Evelyn said quietly. But her daughter's suspicion mirrored her own. As the evening carried on, Evelyn couldn't shake the unease. Every time Richard and Laura crossed paths, there was something in their body language. An ease too comfortable, an inside joke too intimate. Laura touched his arm once as she leaned in to say something, her laugh trailing like perfume. Evelyn's chest ached. She remembered being children, the way Laura always had to have the spotlight, whether it was Christmas pageants or summer picnics. Evelyn had once believed sibling rivalry faded with age, but watching Laura now, she realized some competitions never ended. Only now the stakes were higher. When the music shifted into something upbeat, Laura pulled Richard into a mock dance in front of the guests. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Evelyn's vision narrowed. Richard's hand rested lightly on Laura's waist, and Laura's smile was just a little too bright. Grace hissed under her breath. This is disgusting. Evelyn put a hand on her daughter's arm, her own nails digging into her palm. Don't make a scene, she whispered. But inside, her restraint was wearing thin. Still, she endured. She clinked glasses with neighbors, accepted compliments on the decorations, and hugged Daniel's friends as though nothing were wrong. But her eyes again and again drifted back to her husband and her sister, circling each other like conspirators at the edges of a celebration that was meant to be pure. Helen caught her eye once more across the patio. She didn't speak, but the look she gave Evelyn said everything. I see it too. Evelyn's smile for the crowd remained intact, but her heart whispered the truth she didn't want to admit. This wasn't just her imagination. There was something between Richard and Laura, something that had been hiding in plain sight. And though she wouldn't ruin the night for Daniel, Evelyn knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. This shadow her sister cast was no accident. The graduation party moved forward like clockwork, laughter spilling across the yard, glasses clinking beneath the glow of string lights. From the outside, everything shimmered with joy. But to Evelyn, the night had begun to splinter. Each laugh, each toast, each congratulations only deepened the hollow ache inside her chest. She circulated among the guests, shaking hands, thanking neighbors, smiling for photos with Daniel's classmates. Her lips stretched into smiles, but her mind wasn't in the conversations. Her eyes kept drifting, like a compass drawn only to one direction, toward Richard and Laura. They were careful, but not careful enough. Evelyn caught it in fragments, the lean of Richard's shoulder when Laura whispered something close to his ear, the glimmer of mischief in Laura's smile, the way their laughter overlapped in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. To anyone else, it was harmless. To Evelyn, who knew her husband's body language as well as her own, it was damning. She excused herself to fetch a tray of hors d'oeuvres from the kitchen. Helen joined her inside, setting down her empty glass. You're distracted, Helen said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of friendship. Evelyn glanced over her shoulder. Through the kitchen window, she could still see Richard and Laura together, their heads bent too close. I'm fine, she said, though the words didn't even convince her. Helen didn't push, but her eyes narrowed. You're watching them. Evelyn forced a brittle laugh. It's my sister and my husband at a family party. Who else would I be watching? But Helen said nothing, only gave her a look that told Evelyn she wasn't alone in her suspicions. Later, Evelyn found herself cornered by Grace near the drinks table. Her daughter's eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd like a hawk. Mom, Grace said, lowering her voice, I think Dad and Aunt Laura are too close. Evelyn's heart stopped, though she tried to keep her face composed. Don't say that. I've been watching all night. The way they laugh, the way she touches his arm. It's not normal. Evelyn pressed a hand over Grace's. Focus on your brother tonight. Don't drag this out here. But Grace's voice trembled with anger. How can you pretend not to see it? Because pretending was the only thing Evelyn could do in that moment. She squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. Daniel deserves one night of peace. Promise me you won't say anything. Grace's jaw clenched, but she gave a small nod. Evelyn knew her daughter's loyalty was to her, but she also knew that Grace's silence wouldn't last forever. The evening reached its peak when Richard stood to give a longer speech. He raised his glass, his voice carrying across the yard. Family, he began, is the foundation of everything. It's where we find strength, support, and the reason we strive to be better. The crowd murmured in agreement, glasses lifted high. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, nails biting into her palms. Family is the foundation of everything. She wanted to laugh, to scream. How easily he said the words. How confidently. He went on, praising Daniel for his dedication, Grace for her wit, Evelyn for her steadfastness. Then with a warm glance he added, and of course, we wouldn't be the family we are without the love and support of our extended family. Laura, thank you for always being there. Laura raised her glass, her smile radiating across the lawn. Evelyn felt her stomach twist. His words had been subtle, but his tone, the weight behind them, wasn't lost on her. That thank you was meant to mean something else, something hidden in plain sight. Applause erupted, guests clinking glasses, oblivious to the undercurrent that Evelyn now felt like a knife at her throat. After the speech, as Richard made his way through the crowd, Evelyn slipped away for a moment of solitude. She needed air, space, anything to keep her from unraveling in front of everyone. She walked into the house, her heels soft against the hardwood floor, and paused in the quiet kitchen. That was when she saw it. Richard's phone, left unattended on the counter. The screen lit up with a buzz. Evelyn froze, her breath catching. She hadn't meant to invade his privacy, hadn't even planned to look. But the message blinked across the screen before she could turn away. From Laura. When can we get away again? Last night wasn't enough. Evelyn's world shifted in that instant. The hum of the party outside disappeared. All she could hear was the rushing of her own pulse, a roar in her ears. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone, snapping a quick photo of the screen with her own. Evidence. Proof. For years she had trusted him, built her life around him, given him her loyalty and her years. And this was how he repaid her, with her own sister. She pressed her phone tightly in her palm, her throat burning. For a moment she thought she might collapse under the weight of it. But then a new thought emerged, cold and steady. If Richard and Laura believed she would suffer in silence, they had underestimated her entirely. Evelyn slid his phone back onto the counter, her expression hardening. The celebration outside carried on, oblivious. But within Evelyn, something had shifted. Tonight, she decided, their charade would end. The noise of the party drifted faintly through the kitchen windows, muffled laughter and clinking glasses colliding with Evelyn's heartbeat. She stood frozen, her hand still gripping her phone, the photograph of Laura's message glowing on the screen. One sentence, 9 words, enough to unravel a marriage, a family, a lifetime of trust. She placed Richard's phone back exactly as she had found it, careful, precise. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking she had snooped. Let him believe she was oblivious for a little longer. That, she decided, was her advantage. Her reflection caught in the glass of the sliding door, pale and taut. For a moment, Evelyn saw herself as the world saw her, dignified, dependable, the wife who had kept her family afloat through every storm. Behind that image, however, stood the truth, betrayed, humiliated, enraged. She pressed her palm flat against her chest, willing her breathing to steady. Not here, not like this, not in the kitchen. Daniel's laughter echoed faintly, reminding her of why she couldn't storm out in fury. This was still his night. Whatever she did, it had to protect him from shame, yet make the truth undeniable. Helen appeared in the doorway, a plate in her hand. She stopped short at Evelyn's face. "Oh God," she whispered, setting the plate down. "What happened?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "I know." Helen's brows drew together. "Know what?" Evelyn tilted her head toward the counter. "I saw the message. From Laura." Her voice cracked on her sister's name. Helen's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. "Evelyn." "It's real," Evelyn said flatly. "Not paranoia, not imagination. They've been together." Helen reached for her hand, squeezing it. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn looked past her friend, out toward the glowing lawn where her family and neighbors danced and drank beneath lanterns. She straightened her shoulders. "End it, but not quietly, not hidden in shadows. They want to play their game in secret? Then I'll drag it into the light." Helen hesitated. "Here? Tonight?" "Yes." Evelyn's voice was cold steel now. "In front of everyone. Because I won't be the woman who smiles politely while her husband shares a bed with her sister. If I'm going to bleed, then they'll bleed with me." The conviction in her words surprised even herself, but it felt right. A strange calm settled in her bones. She slipped her phone into her clutch, the photo tucked away like a loaded weapon. When she returned outside, the air felt sharper, every laugh and every glance amplified. Laura stood near the patio bar, sipping wine, her head thrown back in laughter at something Richard had said. Evelyn watched her sister's hand graze Richard's arm again, a gesture too casual to be innocent. Grace spotted her mother rejoining the crowd. She leaned in, whispering, "Mom, I swear, if you don't say something—" "Not yet," Evelyn interrupted, her voice low but firm. "Trust me, Grace. There's a time for truth, and it's coming." Grace studied her mother's face, then nodded. Something in Evelyn's tone convinced her. Daniel, meanwhile, was oblivious, moving from group to group, basking in attention. Evelyn's heart ached for him. He had earned this night, every bit of it. But she knew, better a single night marred by truth than an entire future poisoned by lies. As the evening wore on, Evelyn watched Richard carefully. He was good. She'd give him that. He kept his hand off Laura, laughed a little less obviously, but the tether between them remained, invisible yet tangible. It hung in the air like smoke, and Evelyn could no longer pretend not to breathe it in. She bided her time, waiting for the right moment, when the guests were gathered close, when the attention naturally swiveled back to speeches and toasts. She would stand then. She would not shout or cry. No, her strength would be in composure, in calm revelation. The truth, delivered without theatrics, would burn hotter than any outburst. Her eyes found Helen across the yard. Her friend gave a subtle nod, understanding her resolve. Later, when the music softened and Richard rose to offer another round of thanks, Evelyn's stomach tightened. The crowd gathered near the patio, glasses raised. She stepped closer, her heart pounding but her mind razor-sharp. Richard began again, his words warm and polished. Tonight is a reminder of what matters most: family, loyalty, and love. Evelyn almost laughed. The hypocrisy dripped from his tongue like poison disguised as honey. She pressed her clutch tighter, her fingers brushing the phone inside, the evidence pulsing like a heartbeat against her palm. Loyalty, love. The words that once defined her marriage had become a mockery. And soon, very soon, the world would see them for what they were. By the time dusk fully settled, the backyard shimmered like a stage set for a play. The lanterns cast warm halos over faces flushed from wine and celebration. The music softened to a steady rhythm, and laughter swirled in the air like smoke. To every guest present, the evening looked perfect, an emblem of success, a family gathered in pride. But for Evelyn, the perfection was only a mask stretched over something rotten. She stood near the head table, her clutch pressed tightly against her side. Inside lay the photograph of Laura's message, proof of betrayal that pulsed like a secret heartbeat. Her eyes moved across the crowd, past the glowing smiles until they landed, inevitably, on Richard and Laura. They stood close, too close. Laura's hand brushed the sleeve of his jacket as if by accident, though Evelyn knew her sister never did anything without intention. Richard's laughter rang a little too loudly in her ear, his smile a shade too broad. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Every glance between them was a thread in a web that had ensnared her life. But Evelyn did not allow herself to flinch. Instead, she adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat and turned her expression into one of serene calm. There was power in patience, she realized. They had no idea she knew. That ignorance was her shield. As the evening drifted into speeches, Richard rose again, commanding the crowd with ease. "Friends, family," he said, lifting his glass. "Tonight we celebrate Daniel's hard work, his determination, and the bright future ahead of him." Applause echoed around the yard. Daniel beamed, his face flushed with pride. Evelyn's chest swelled with love for her son, even as the bitterness in her throat threatened to choke her. Richard continued, his voice deep, confident. "But beyond Daniel's success, tonight is about us, about the bonds that hold us together, about family, because without family, none of this matters." A murmur of agreement rippled across the crowd. Guests raised their glasses, some dabbing at eyes already softened by sentiment. Evelyn felt her lips curl, not in a smile, but in something between disbelief and disgust. Family, bonds, loyalty. He had the audacity to proclaim such words while standing hand in hand with deception. When Richard finished, Evelyn stepped forward. Her movement silenced the murmurs. She had not planned this precise moment, but something in his word, his performance, snapped the last thread of restraint inside her. She smiled, the picture of grace, as she accepted the microphone from her husband. "If I may," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to hush the chatter. Richard looked at her curiously, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his eyes. Laura stiffened in the corner, her wineglass trembling slightly in her grip. Grace, standing near her brother, leaned forward, anticipation lighting her gaze. Evelyn cleared her throat, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "Tonight," she began, "is indeed about Daniel. About his hard work, his resilience, his dreams." Her voice warmed as she looked at her son. I could not be prouder of the man you've become. The guest clapped gently, nodding. Evelyn smiled, then let her tone shift, subtle, sharper. But as we celebrate Daniel's future, I find myself reflecting on what it means to build a life, to share trust, to believe in loyalty. Because without those things, what are we truly? A stillness crept over the lawn. It wasn't unusual for Evelyn to speak thoughtfully, but tonight her words carried a hidden weight, a sharpened edge. Trust, she continued, her gaze flickering to Richard, then Laura, is the foundation of any family. Without it, laughter is hollow, words are empty, and celebrations. She gestured lightly at the glowing decorations, the champagne flutes, become little more than a disguise. Murmurs stirred in the crowd. Richard shifted in his chair, his smile faltering. Laura's fingers tightened around her glass. Evelyn felt the shift ripple outward, the guests sensing, even if they didn't yet understand, that something more hovered beneath her words. Helen, standing near the buffet, caught Evelyn's eye. She gave a subtle nod of encouragement, her expression unreadable to anyone else. Grace straightened, her hand brushing her brother's arm as if to steady him. Daniel frowned, confused, glancing between his mother and father. Evelyn's voice softened then, almost tender. Daniel, my son, you deserve honesty in your life. You deserve to know that the people you trust most stand firmly by your side, that their words of loyalty are not just for show. A hush blanketed the crowd. Evelyn could feel hearts tightening, breaths catching. She let the silence stretch, her gaze steady on her husband and her sister. Richard's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table edge. Laura's face had drained of color, her composure cracking under the scrutiny of 100 curious eyes. Evelyn smiled faintly, though the smile did not reach her eyes. And so, tonight, before we close this beautiful celebration, I think it's only right that we remember. The truth always finds its way to the surface. Always. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few guests glanced between Richard and Laura, suspicion beginning to bloom. Evelyn lowered the microphone slowly, letting her words linger like smoke in the night air. She wasn't finished, not yet, but she had lit the match. The fire she knew would burn soon enough. The silence that followed Evelyn's toast was heavier than any applause. Guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between her poised figure and the stiff faces of Richard and Laura. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the lights and the clink of ice in forgotten glasses. Richard forced a laugh, a brittle sound that didn't carry. Well, he said, his voice too loud, leave it to Evelyn to make us reflect deeply, even at a celebration. He reached for the microphone, but Evelyn held it tighter, her eyes never leaving his. Not so fast, Richard, she said, her voice calm but cutting through the murmurs like glass shattering. The crowd hushed. Again. Laura's hand trembled visibly now, her wine sloshing in its glass. Evelyn drew in a steady breath. Since we're speaking of loyalty and family, I think it's only fair we bring everything into the open. Don't you agree? Her eyes scanned the guests, pausing on Daniel, whose confusion was etched plainly across his face. Grace's jaw was set tight, her eyes burning with anticipation. Helen moved closer, her presence a silent shield of support. Richard's smile faltered. Evelyn, maybe this isn't the time. Oh, but it is, she interrupted. There's no better time than when family and friends are gathered, when masks are already slipping. A ripple of unease spread through the guests. Evelyn reached into her clutch, pulling out her phone. The glow of the screen reflected against her face, illuminating the calm fury in her eyes. Would you like to hear, she said slowly, what my sister, Laura, wrote to my husband just last night? Gasps erupted instantly, like sparks catching dry leaves. The crowd leaned in, eyes wide, whispers hissing between neighbors. Daniel stiffened, staring at his mother in disbelief. Grace gripped his arm, whispering something he couldn't process. Richard's face drained of color. Evelyn, don't... But she already had. Evelyn lifted the phone and read, her voice clear and unwavering. When can we get away again? Last night wasn't enough. The words dropped into the silence like stones into water, sending ripples through every corner of the yard. Guests covered their mouths, others glanced at each other in shock, some shaking their heads. Phones began lifting discreetly, recording. Laura nearly dropped her glass, her lips parting in horror. Evelyn, that's not what? Evelyn snapped, her calm cracking into steel. Not what you wrote? Not what you sent to a man who isn't yours to send it to? All eyes turned to Richard, who sat rigid, his jaw locked, sweat beating at his temples. He tried to stand, but Evelyn's voice pinned him in place. For years, she continued, her tone sharp, I've been the wife who supported you, who raised your children, who stood quietly beside you while you played the perfect husband. And this is how you repay me, with my own sister. The weight of her words pressed on everyone present. Daniel's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Dad? He whispered, but Richard couldn't meet his eyes. Laura found her voice then, trembling. Evelyn, please. It was a mistake. It's not what you think. Don't you dare! Evelyn cut in, her voice rising now. Don't you dare stand in front of my children, in front of this family, and call your betrayal a mistake. A mistake is spilling wine on a tablecloth. What you did was deliberate. What you did was unforgivable. The crowd murmured louder, some nodding in sympathy, others whispering in shock. Evelyn turned her gaze back to Richard, her eyes sharp with decades of buried hurt. And you, how many times did you smile at me, knowing full well where you had been? How many speeches about family values did you give while sneaking away to betray everything you claimed to stand for? Richard tried to speak, his lips parting, but no words came. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of his humiliation. Daniel's voice broke then, raw with pain. How could you? His eyes flicked between his father and his aunt. Disbelief etched deep in his young face. Grace, her voice sharp and shaking, added, You're both disgusting. Laura reached for her niece, but Grace recoiled, stepping back as though burned. Don't touch me. Evelyn stood tall, her pearl necklace glinting in the lights. You thought you could humiliate me quietly behind closed doors, she said, her voice steady once more. But I will not be silenced. If I am to be humiliated, then you will be humiliated with me. You will feel the sting of truth in front of every person whose respect you once craved. The crowd erupted in low whispers, the atmosphere thick with tension. Some turned away uncomfortable. Others stared, riveted by the unraveling of a family in real time. Helen placed a hand lightly on Evelyn's shoulder, a silent sign of solidarity. Evelyn lowered the microphone, her breath even. The reveal had been done. The fire had been lit. And as she stepped back, leaving Richard and Laura exposed beneath the judgmental eyes of their community, she felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Freedom. The backyard no longer felt like a celebration. The music had faded into awkward silence, the hum of conversation replaced by gasps, whispers, and the sharp edge of shame cutting through the night. Richard stood frozen, his jaw clenched, eyes darting as though searching for an escape. Laura, pale and trembling, tried to force a smile that collapsed under the weight of everyone's stares. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering into their phones, others outright filming. What had begun as Daniel's night of triumph had become a spectacle of betrayal. Daniel's chair scraped loudly against the patio stones as he stood. His face was red, his fists clenched at his sides. All this time, he said, his voice cracking, while I was working my ass off to make you proud, you were sneaking around with her? His gaze cut between his father and his aunt, disbelief and fury battling for dominance. Richard reached out. Daniel, don't you dare, Daniel spat. Don't you dare say my name like you've earned the right. His voice cracked into silence. Grace, standing beside him, added venomously, You ruined tonight. You ruined everything. She turned to Laura then, her voice rising. You were supposed to be family. You were supposed to be my aunt. And you, her voice shook with disgust. You're nothing but a homewrecker. Laura flinched, her hands trembling. Grace, please, I never meant. Don't lie, Grace snapped. You've always wanted what Mom had, and now you've destroyed the one thing she should have been able to trust. Evelyn remained calm, though her insides burned like fire. She didn't stop her children's words. They were owed their anger. She simply stood, watching Richard and Laura shrink under the judgment of not just their family, but their entire community. Helen's voice cut in, sharp and clear. "I think it's time you left," she said to Laura, her eyes icy. "You've done enough damage for one night." Guests murmured in agreement. Some crossed their arms, others whispered openly about reputations, about disgrace, about betrayal that would stain both Richard and Laura for years. Richard tried to salvage his dignity, raising his hands. "This is a misunderstanding." But Evelyn stepped forward, her voice slicing through his excuse. "Don't insult us further, Richard. I read the message aloud. The proof is right here. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is the truth." Gasps echoed again, as though the crowd needed reminding of the words Evelyn had delivered. Phones tilted higher. A few of Richard's colleagues exchanged pointed looks, their respect for him evaporating with every passing second. Laura set her glass down with a trembling hand. "I should go," she whispered, her eyes darting for the nearest exit. "Run if you want," Evelyn said coldly. "But the truth follows you. It will follow you both." Daniel's voice shook with rage. "Get out, both of you." He didn't care that it was his father, didn't care that it was his aunt. All he saw were the people who had desecrated his graduation night. Richard tried again, desperation leaking into his tone. "Son, please." "Don't call me that," Daniel snapped, his chest heaving. "You're not my father tonight. You're nothing to me right now." The words landed like a physical blow. Richard stumbled back slightly, his face collapsing. Grace slipped an arm around her brother, steadying him as he shook with fury. Together, they turned away from their father and aunt. Evelyn followed them with her eyes, her heart breaking for their pain, but firm in her belief that they needed to see the truth now, rather than live years in ignorance. Laura left first, nearly tripping on her heels as she fled through the side gate, whispers and glares chasing her. Richard remained, rooted, sweat beading on his brow. The weight of judgment crushed him from all directions. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her tone steady, final. "Leave, Richard. This night is no longer yours." The words stripped him of his last shred of dignity. Slowly, he turned, walking out into the night without looking back, the sound of murmurs and disappointment following him. When the gate closed behind him, Evelyn exhaled. For the first time in hours, she felt a strange, quiet power settle in her chest. She had burned her marriage to ash in public view, but from the ashes she knew something stronger could rise. The days after the graduation party spread through the town like wildfire. Whispers became headlines in community circles, and soon Richard Carter, the once respected businessman, was spoken of with disdain. "Cheated on his wife with her sister," the neighbors said, in front of everyone. His name no longer commanded respect. It drew pity, scorn, even laughter. Laura became a ghost at family gatherings. Cousins whispered behind her back, friends avoided her calls, and the invitations that once filled her calendar evaporated overnight. She had wanted attention, admiration, and envy. What she received instead was isolation. Daniel, though shaken, began to heal. He threw himself into work, into the future Evelyn had always wanted for him. One evening, weeks later, he hugged his mother tightly. "You saved me from years of lies, Mom," he whispered. "I'll never forget that." Grace remained Evelyn's fiercest defender, her sharp tongue ensuring no one dared diminish what their mother had endured. "She stood up when most people would have stayed quiet," Grace told her friends proudly. "That's the kind of woman I want to be." Evelyn herself walked through the days with a quiet dignity. The betrayal had cut deep, but the act of revealing it, of refusing to bear it silently, had freed her. For the first time in decades, she wasn't defined by Richard's choices. She was defined by her own courage.